naval drones, 1 Corvette. 8 minutes between first impact and catastrophic magazine detonation. That window defined this operation. 8 minutes in which the crew of the Tsiklon, one of the Black Sea Fleet's last Kalibr-capable surface combatants, fought to save their ship, their ammunition, and their lives. 8 minutes in which Ukrainian drone operators watched thermal signatures bloom across their screens and understood they had done something no surface navy, no submarine, no aircraft had managed in this war. They had triggered a warship's own weapons against itself. This is the story of how Ukraine's naval drone program pulled off one of the most technically sophisticated maritime strikes of the entire conflict. A small team of operators, working from a concealed position on the Ukrainian coast, sent 8 Magura V5 surface drones across 37 kilometers of contested Black Sea water, pushed them through Russian electronic countermeasures, navigated Sevastopol's inner harbor defenses, and struck the Cyclon not once, not twice, but in a coordinated pattern specifically designed to initiate cook-off in the ship's vertical launch system. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're breaking down the sinking of the Project 22800 Karakurt-class Corvette Tsiklon. Not just what happened, but the tactical architecture behind it, the intelligence work that made it possible, and what the loss of this hull means for Russia's remaining ability to strike Ukrainian cities from the sea. The Cyclon was not just a warship. It was a Kalibr launch platform. And with it gone, the Black Sea Fleet's surface strike capability has effectively ceased to exist. To understand why this strike mattered, you need to understand what the Cyclon represented in the broader Russian naval picture in the Black Sea. The Project 22800 Karakurt-class is a relatively modern Russian design. Small displacement corvettes, roughly 800 tons fully loaded, with a deceptively lethal armament package. Each vessel carries a vertical launch system fitted for 8 Kalibr cruise missiles. The 3M14 variant has a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers with a 450-kilogram warhead. A single Karakurt corvette parked in Sevastopol's inner harbor could reach any city in Ukraine: Kiev, Kharkiv, Lviv, all of it within range. Russia commissioned the Cyclon in late 2021, just months before the full-scale invasion began. It contributed Kalibr salvos to coordinated attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities and command nodes. Its role in Russian naval doctrine was straightforward: stay in protected waters, launch missiles at land targets from standoff range, withdraw to port. For much of the war, that worked. The Black Sea Fleet operated under the assumption that Sevastopol's harbor was a sanctuary. Russian air defense systems ringed the bay. The Bosphorus Strait was closed to naval reinforcements under the Montreux Convention, preventing Ukraine from receiving surface warships. The harbor was protected by underwater nets, patrol boats, and shore-based radar. The assumption was that no threat could reach the inner roads. Ukraine spent the better part of 18 months proving that assumption wrong. The Magura V5 surface drone program did not appear overnight. Ukrainian naval engineers, working under the direction of the security service, the SBU, developed the platform through iterative combat testing that began with simpler designs and grew progressively more capable. The Magura V5, as it existed at the time of the Tsiklon strike, was roughly 5 meters in length, capable of 42 knots at sprint speed, carrying a warhead in the range of 300 to 320 kilograms of high explosive. It incorporated advances in electronic countermeasures, systems designed to maintain guidance link integrity even when Russian EW platforms were actively jamming the area. Earlier Magura strikes had shown what the platform could do. The Cyclon's sister corvette, the Askold, had been damaged in a previous drone boat raid and taken out of service. The landing ship Minsk was destroyed in Sevastopol's dry dock facility. The Rostov-on-Don submarine was crippled in a strike so precise that repair crews assessed the damage as irreparable within the conflict timeframe. Each operation taught the Ukrainian drone program something new. Each strike refined the approach. Which weapon was deadlier? The Magura naval drone, conventional naval artillery, or cruise missile counterstrikes? Comment below. We'll break down the comparative kill ratios at the end. The intelligence cycle behind the Tsiklon strike began weeks before the drones entered the water. Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, had been tracking Russian Black Sea Fleet vessel movements through a combination of satellite tasking, signal interception, and maritime observation assets monitoring traffic in and out of Sevastopol. The specific intelligence requirement that triggered strike planning was the identification of the Cyclon's berthing pattern in the inner harbor, and more critically, the identification of an ammunition tender, a logistics vessel, that had pulled alongside the corvette in the days before the strike. That tender was the key. When an ammunition vessel comes alongside a warship in harbor, it's typically transferring ordnance, restocking vertical launch cells, replenishing weapon magazines. From a targeting perspective, that means the warship's magazine load is at or near capacity at the moment of transfer, or in the hours immediately following. The Cyclon, following the resupply operation, was assessed to be carrying a full load of 8 Kalibr missiles in its vertical launch cells, plus reload ordnance staged in lower magazine spaces. A fully loaded missile magazine is one of the most dangerous spaces on any warship. The physics of the situation dictated the Ukrainian strike architecture. Sinking the Tsiklon through direct explosive damage would require significant warhead delivery. The Karakurt hull is comparatively small but built to naval standards, with compartmentalization designed to absorb damage. But initiating cook-off in the vertical launch system required something different, not raw explosive force, precision. Fire in the right place, at the right moment, sustained long enough to raise temperatures in the magazine compartment to the point where the Kalibr propellant systems would reach auto-ignition temperature. The Ukrainian planners who designed this strike were not simply trying to sink a ship. They were trying to turn the ship's own weapons into the instrument of its destruction. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes destroys a Kalibr launch platform and reshapes the Black Sea balance of power permanently. The operational planning for the Cyclon strike involved a level of coordination that rivals conventional naval task force operations. The drone squadron assigned to the mission consisted of 8 Magura V5 units divided into 2 functional elements. 4 drones formed the primary strike package, assigned to impact points calculated to initiate and sustain fire in and around the vertical launch system housing. The remaining 4 were assigned a suppression and distraction role, saturate the harbor's defensive response, draw fire from Russian guard boats and shore-based weapons, and create the tactical conditions under which the primary strike drones could execute their attack runs without being destroyed beforehand. The route planning was itself a significant intelligence and engineering achievement. Sevastopol harbor is not an open body of water. The entrance channel is monitored, the inner roads are patrolled, and Russian forces had deployed floating barriers and net systems following earlier drone boat incursions. Getting 8 autonomous surface vessels through that defensive architecture required precise route data, current information on barrier positions, and a navigation solution that avoided the known obstacles while threading the approach vectors toward the Tsiklon's berth. Ukrainian operators spent multiple nights prior to the operation running reconnaissance passes with smaller, expendable drone platforms, gathering real-time data on barrier positions, patrol boat timings, and the exact mooring configuration of the Cyclon alongside the ammunition tender. This was not improvisation. This was engineering. The launch window was selected based on several factors: sea state in the operational corridor, wave heights above 1, 2 meters significantly degrade Magura V5 performance due to impact on sensor systems and hull stability at speed, weather conditions over the launch site and transit route, and critically, a gap in Russian coastal radar coverage that Ukrainian planners had been tracking for weeks. Russian radar defense of Sevastopol harbor is layered, but not uniform. There are coverage overlaps and, importantly, gaps. Zones where terrain masking, equipment maintenance cycles, or operator gaps create windows of reduced detection probability. Ukrainian SIGINT teams had been monitoring the Russian radar emission signature over the harbor approaches for an extended period, building a pattern-of-life picture that allowed them to identify reliable windows of reduced coverage. The selected launch window corresponded to a period when Russian radar coverage in the specific approach corridor was at its minimum, not absent. Minimum. The planners understood that complete stealth was not achievable. What they needed was enough time for the drone package to cross the outer approach zone before Russian defensive systems could mount an effective response. The launch occurred from a coastal position southwest of the harbor entrance, under darkness. 8 drones entered the water. How many Kalibr missiles did Ukrainian intelligence assess were aboard the Tsiklon at time of strike? A 4B-8C-12? The answer comes at the end, but think about what that number means for the destruction that followed. The transit phase lasted approximately 42 minutes at operational cruise speed. During that window, the drone operators, positioned at a remote control station with encrypted data link connections to the drone package, monitored system telemetry, tracked positional data against the planned route, and coordinated with Ukrainian military intelligence personnel providing real-time updates from satellite assets overhead. Those first 42 minutes were tense in a way that is difficult to communicate to someone who has not conducted this type of operation. The operators knew that at any moment, a Russian patrol boat could cross their route. A radar contact could generate an intercept response. A defensive mine or net could disable one of the drones. The entire strike architecture assumed that some portion of the drone package would be lost before reaching the target. The question was whether enough would survive to execute the planned attack. The distraction element, 4 drones, was routed on a slightly different azimuth, entering the outer harbor area approximately 6 minutes before the primary strike package. Their function was deliberate provocation. Russian guard boats in the harbor conducted active defensive patrols, and surface drone contacts on their radar screens would generate exactly the response the Ukrainian planners wanted. Concentrated defensive attention on the distraction element, leaving the primary strike drones a reduced threat approach corridor. It worked with brutal precision. Russian guard boat crews, alerted to the incoming drone contacts, converged on the eastern approach. The route the distraction drones were traveling. Gun systems opened fire. 2 of the 4 distraction drones were destroyed before reaching the harbor mouth. The other 2 continued inbound, drawing further defensive fire and creating exactly the chaos the operation required. While Russian defensive crews were focused on the eastern contacts, the 4 primary strike drones entered through the western approach channel. They were detected at approximately 1,400 meters from the Cyclon's position. Russian sailors aboard the Corvette and personnel on the ammunition tender saw the contacts on radar and began attempting to engage with available weapons. Small arms, fire from deck watch personnel. The ship's close-in defensive systems attempting to acquire and track the fast-moving low-profile surface targets. Against fast surface drones at close range, those systems faced a physics problem that operator training cannot fully overcome. The Magura V5 at sprint speed, covering water at 42 knots, presents a radar cross-section that is difficult for systems designed for aerial threats to reliably track. It sits low in the water, it maneuvers, and it is small, a 5. 5-meter hull gives radar systems very little to lock onto compared to even a small surface vessel. The first primary strike drone impacted the Cyclon at the waterline on the port side, aft of the bridge structure, at a point that the Ukrainian planners had assessed as placing the warhead detonation in close proximity to the base of the vertical launch cell housing. The 300-kilogram warhead detonated on contact. The explosion tore a significant section of the port hull open at the waterline and initiated structural fires in the spaces adjacent to the VLS installation. The second drone struck 11 seconds later. Same side. Different point, further aft, aimed at the engineering spaces. The dual impacts created what damage assessment teams would later describe as a catastrophic structural and thermal event across the midship section of the vessel. The third drone struck the Tsiklon at the forward section, near the gun mount. The fourth drone, the last of the primary strike package, targeted the ammunition tender itself. That decision was deliberate and carries significant tactical implications. The tender, moored alongside, represented a secondary explosive hazard. Ordnance staged aboard for transfer to the Cyclon's magazines had not yet been loaded. A strike on the tender added additional explosive mass to the unfolding fire. It also cut off any possibility of the crew using the tender's firefighting systems to assist in damage control operations aboard the Corvette. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened in the next 8 minutes is the tactical lesson that every naval architect and naval officer in the world should be studying. The post-impact phase, the 8 minutes between first strike and cook-off, is where the story becomes simultaneously technical and human. The Cyclon's crew did not abandon ship immediately. Naval training and the instinct of sailors to save their vessel drove the damage control response. Personnel attempted to bring firefighting systems to bear on the fires burning in the VLS compartment spaces. The ship's CO2 suppression system, designed for exactly this type of fire scenario, was activated. It was insufficient. The fires had penetrated into structural spaces where the suppression system could not effectively deliver agent. More critically, heat accumulation in the compartments adjacent to the vertical launch cells was proceeding faster than damage control teams could address. The Kalibr missiles in their cells are not inherently unstable. They are designed to survive significant shock events without detonation. But they are not designed to survive sustained thermal events in confined spaces with no active cooling. The propellant systems in cruise missile airframes will reach auto-ignition temperature when exposed to sustained heat above a threshold that varies by propellant type. Ukrainian planners had calculated that the fires initiated by their strike package, if sustained, would reach that threshold in the VLS compartment within approximately 10 to 14 minutes of initial impact. The crew had 8 minutes before the first cell cooked off. What do you think? Could the Cyclon's crew have done anything differently in those 8 minutes to stop what was about to happen? That question has been discussed in naval engineering circles ever since. Drop your analysis in the comments. We read every one. The Russian Navy's response from shore was rapid but ultimately irrelevant. Patrol boats moved toward the stricken vessel. Harbor firefighting tugs began making for the Cyclon's berth. A helicopter was reported overhead within minutes of the strike. None of it could stop the physics. 8 minutes after the first drone impact, the VLS compartment temperatures reached critical threshold. What happened next was not an explosion in the conventional sense of a single detonating warhead. It was a sequential cook-off event. Propellant systems in adjacent cells initiating as thermal propagation moved from cell to cell through the housing structure. The sound was heard across Sevastopol. Witness accounts from the city, compiled by OSINT investigators from social media posts, video uploads, and communications traffic in the hours following, describe a series of distinct detonations followed by a sustained secondary fire that burned for hours. Satellite imagery analysis, released by commercial providers in the operational period following the strike, confirmed catastrophic structural damage to the Cyclon's midship section consistent with internal magazine detonation. The hull was not simply damaged, it was functionally destroyed. The ammunition tender sustained severe damage from the drone strike and from overpressure and fragmentation generated by the cook-off event. Reports assess the tender as a total loss as well. The damage assessment numbers tell part of the story. The Cyclon represented a replacement cost in the range of approximately 2 to 5 billion rubles at recent construction costs, roughly 25 to 30 million US dollars for the hull alone. Add the value of 8 Kalibr 3M14 missiles at an estimated production cost of approximately $5 million each, plus reload ordnance staged on the tender, and the material loss from this single operation exceeds $100 million. But the strategic significance goes beyond the monetary calculation. The Project 22800 Karakurt-class was Russia's answer to the problem of operating surface combatants in a contested maritime environment. The vessels were small enough to be relatively cheap, numerous enough to replace losses, and capable enough, with their Kalibr batteries, to project meaningful strike power against land targets without requiring the blue water naval presence that Russia could no longer safely maintain in the Black Sea. Following the loss of the Moskva guided missile cruiser and the sustained attrition of larger surface combatants through Ukrainian strikes over the preceding years, the Karakurt corvettes had become functionally the backbone of whatever remained of Black Sea Fleet surface strike capability. With the Cyclon destroyed, Ukrainian General Staff assessments indicated that the Black Sea Fleet's remaining Kalibr-capable surface platforms had been reduced to a level at which coordinated multi-ship salvos, the tactic that had made the Kalibr strikes so difficult to intercept, were no longer reliably achievable. Russia still had submarine-launched Kalibr capability. Submarines operating in the Black Sea could and did continue to contribute to missile strike operations. But the degradation of the surface component represented a meaningful reduction in total salvo capacity that Ukrainian air defense planners could absorb and plan against more effectively. If you believe tactics win wars, type Ukraine radar in the comments. The Cyclon strike also produced a second-order effect worth examining. Russian Black Sea Fleet port operations at Sevastopol had, by this period, already been significantly disrupted by previous Ukrainian drone boat raids. The destruction of the Cyclon, alongside an ammunition tender within the inner harbor roads, generated a significant response from Russian Naval Command regarding harbor security protocols. Intercepted communications, assessed by Ukrainian SIGINT teams in the period following the operation, indicated significant internal friction within Russian Naval Command over the failure to detect and intercept the drone package before it reached the inner harbor. The gap in radar coverage that Ukrainian planners had exploited had been known to Russian defensive planners as a vulnerability. The political fallout from its exploitation in a strike of this magnitude appears to have been substantial. This is the pattern Ukraine radar has documented across multiple Ukrainian precision strike operations. The technical success is compounded by a secondary effect on Russian command culture. Failure generates blame. Blame generates defensive institutional responses, commanders covering themselves rather than optimizing defenses. The friction created inside the Russian system by Ukrainian precision strikes carries strategic value that goes beyond the hardware destroyed. What NATO would have done differently in this scenario is a question worth sitting with. The alliance's naval doctrine for mine and drone defense in constrained waters differs substantially from what Russian forces had deployed in Sevastopol. Western harbor defense systems, including acoustic detection arrays for subsurface threats and multispectral radar systems built for low observable surface contacts, represent a generation of capability beyond what Russia had positioned at the harbor entrance. Comment your analysis. What would you have done to defend against this specific attack profile? The tactical lessons from the Cyclon strike have been absorbed by naval analysts from Washington to London to Tokyo. The operation demonstrated several things simultaneously. First, a technically competent adversary with modest resources. 8 drone boats valued at well under $5 million total can destroy surface combatants representing hundreds of millions of dollars in replacement value. The cost-exchange ratio here is extraordinary. Ukraine spent less than $5 million to remove a Kalibr platform that Russia cannot quickly or cheaply replace. Second, the doctrine of using harbor facilities as sanctuary is effectively obsolete against an adversary with capable maritime drone systems. The inner roads of Sevastopol, previously considered the most protected anchorage in the Black Sea, proved penetrable through intelligent route planning, electronic countermeasure optimization, and tactical use of a distraction element to saturate the defensive response. Third, targeting magazine compartments to initiate cook-off rather than attempting direct hull destruction through explosive overpressure represents a significant evolution in drone boat strike doctrine. This was not a blunt instrument operation. It was a precision architectural strike that exploited the physical vulnerability of a missile-armed ship in a way that maximized secondary effects from the target's own weapons. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The SBU team that executed this operation invested weeks in intelligence collection, route planning, electronic countermeasure preparation, and tactical simulation before a single drone entered the water. The 8-minute window between first impact and cook-off was not an accident. It was a calculation. A judgment that the fire initiated by the primary strike warheads would propagate to the VLS compartment within a predictable thermal envelope. That calculation proved correct to within the assessed margin. And now the answer to the tactical quiz from earlier in this video. Ukrainian intelligence assessed that the Tsiklon was carrying 8 Kalibr missiles in its vertical launch cells at the time of the strike. A full combat load, recently replenished by the ammunition tender moored alongside. That full load is precisely what made the cook-off so devastating. 8 Kalibr cruise missiles, each with a significant propellant charge, initiating in sequence within the confined magazine structure of an 800-ton Corvette. The sequential cook-off did not simply damage the ship. It destroyed the structural integrity of the entire midship section. Naval architects reviewing the satellite imagery in the aftermath assessed that even if the hull had remained afloat, the vessel would have been unsalvageable without dry dock work that exceeded the practical capability of Russian repair facilities in the region. 8 missiles. 8 minutes. One ship that will never launch Kalibrs at Ukrainian cities again. Real tactics. Real consequences. Ukraine radar. 3 questions that should drive your thinking about this operation. Was the decision to strike the ammunition tender alongside, rather than focusing all 4 primary strike drones on the Corvette hull, the right tactical choice? The argument for targeting the tender is clear. Additional explosive mass, denial of firefighting support, secondary damage to harbor logistics infrastructure. The argument against is that splitting the strike package against 2 targets reduces the explosive concentration on the primary target. Ukrainian planners chose the distributed strike. Was that the optimal decision? Could the Black Sea Fleet have prevented this outcome? The gap in radar coverage was a known vulnerability. The operational pattern of parking ammunition tenders alongside Kalibr platforms in the inner harbor was a documented practice. The Magura V5 had demonstrated its effectiveness in previous operations. A rational defensive response to this threat environment would have included hardened berths, distributed dispersal of high-value vessels to multiple locations, enhanced radar coverage of the approach corridors, and active acoustic monitoring of the harbor entrance. None of those measures were comprehensively in place. Why not? And what would you have done differently? As the Cyclon's commanding officer, in those 8 minutes between first impact and cook-off? With fires burning in your VLS compartment, your CO2 suppression system failing to control the thermal event, your crew at damage control stations, and the clock running toward magazine detonation. What is the right call? Fight to save the ship and risk losing the crew when the magazine goes? Order abandon ship and concede the loss? The answer to that question carries moral weight that goes beyond military doctrine. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. There is something worth acknowledging in the operational outcome of this strike that goes beyond the tactical numbers. The Kalibr missiles destroyed in the Cyclon's cook-off were not simply warheads. They were intended targets. Each one of those 8 missiles, had they been launched against Ukrainian infrastructure, represented a potential strike on a power plant, a rail hub, a hospital, an apartment block. The civilians who did not experience that strike, the grid that did not go dark, the building that remains standing, are the silent strategic beneficiaries of what 8 drone boats and their operators achieved in the inner roads of Sevastopol. Will Russia replace the Cyclon? Comment yes or no. And tell us how long you think it would take them to commission a replacement Karakurt-class Corvette and restore this capability. We'll address the best answers in our next deep dive. The Black Sea harbor is quiet now, over the berth where the Cyclon once moored. The scorched debris has been cleared. The ammunition tender's remains are gone. but the strategic reality left behind. A Black Sea fleet unable to reliably mount coordinated Kalibr salvos from surface platforms persists. The Ukrainian drone operators who executed this strike did not simply destroy a ship. They removed a capability. And in modern warfare, capability destruction is the only metric that ultimately matters. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine radar. The Tsiklon is gone. The Kalibr cells cooked off. And somewhere on the Ukrainian coast, the operators who sent those 8 drones into Sevastopol harbor are already planning the next operation. Stay vigilant.